Chapter 1. The Locked Cottage. The discovery was made shortly after dawn by Mr. Harold Pritchard, the postman, who had grown accustomed to leaving letters in the brass box fixed beside Greywood Cottage's front gate. That morning the box was unusually full. He knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still no answer. The curtains were drawn tightly across the front window, as they always were. Something felt different. A wrongness he could not quite explain. He walked around to the side path and noticed that the back door was closed, locked. From the inside. That detail would later trouble Inspector Alan Mercer more than anything else. Because locked doors in quiet villages rarely told the truth. When the constable arrived, the door was forced open carefully, avoiding damage where possible. Inside, the air was heavy, still, almost preserved, and there, in the small sitting room beside a cold fireplace, they found her, Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell, seated in her armchair, perfectly still. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no open windows, only a teacup resting neatly on the side table, though she had simply finished a quiet moment and chosen not to rise again. The village doctor was summoned immediately. His verdict came with quiet certainty. Natural causes, he said. Heart failure, most likely. Age, isolation, nothing unusual. Should have ended there. And for many in Little Wrenford it did. But Inspector Mercer did not leave so easily, because something about Greywood Cottage resisted explanation. The locked door, for one, and the position of the body for another. Too composed, too deliberate, as though even death had been arranged carefully. Interesting, very interesting. By mid-morning, news had already spread through the village. Mrs. Hartwell was gone. Quietly, as she had lived, but not everyone accepted the simplicity of it. Among them was Miss Jane Marple, who happened to be staying with her niece nearby, and heard of the death over tea, delivered with the kind of nervous excitement that always accompanies unexpected tragedy. Greywood Cottage, her niece said. You remember it, don't you? The old woman who never spoke to anyone. Miss Marple set down her cup slowly. Yes, she said thoughtfully. I remember her. Pause followed. And people who never speak to anyone, she added gently, are often the ones most worth listening to in the end. That afternoon, she asked to visit the cottage. Inspector Mercer agreed, though not without hesitation. He had heard of Miss Marple. Like many policemen before him, he had learned that her curiosity was never casual. Greywood Cottage looked unchanged from outside, still ivy-covered, still withdrawn, still refusing the world. But inside, everything felt slightly altered, as though the house was holding its breath. Miss Marple moved slowly through the small sitting room where the body had been found. She looked at the armchair, the teacup, the untouched surroundings. Then she paused near the fireplace. Interesting, she murmured softly. Inspector Mercer turned. What is it? Miss Marple pointed gently. The ash. The inspector frowned. There's nothing unusual there. Oh yes, she said. There is. She leaned slightly closer. The fire was not lit recently. A pause. But something was burned. The inspector stepped forward. What makes you say that? Miss Marple straightened. Because the ash is too fine for ordinary coal. Silence followed. She continued quietly. And because there is a faint scent of paper. The room became still. Interesting, very interesting. Inspector Mercer looked more closely now. You think something was destroyed before she died? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the small writing desk in the corner of the room. The drawer was slightly ajar, just enough to notice. Inside were neatly arranged items, a pen, a pair of spectacles, and an empty envelope, carefully opened, but empty nonetheless. The inspector noticed her attention. Nothing of value has been taken, he said. No sign of burglary. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she replied. That is precisely what makes it interesting. A pause. Because someone did not come here to steal. She looked toward the armchair where Mrs. Hartwell had been found.
They came to retrieve something.
Outside, the wind moved softly through the hedges surrounding Greywood Cottage, and for the first time that morning, Inspector Mercer began to feel what Miss Marple already understood. This was not a natural death interrupted by circumstance. It was a carefully arranged silence. Somewhere within that silence lay a truth that someone had been willing to protect, even at the cost of a life. Part 2. Burnt Letters. The next morning, Greywood Cottage was no longer simply a place where a death had occurred. It had become a question, and questions, in villages like Little Renford, spread faster than facts. Inspector Mercer returned early, this time with a clearer sense of unease than before. Miss Marple was already there, standing just outside the cottage gate, as though she had been observing the house, rather than merely arriving at it. "You're early," he said. "I find," Miss Marple replied gently, "that houses sometimes reveal more in the morning light than they do under questioning. Interesting. Very interesting." Inside, the air still carried the faint, lingering stillness of Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell's final moments. The armchair remained untouched. The teacup had been removed for examination, but the space it had occupied felt strangely significant, though absence itself had weight. Inspector Mercer placed a small notebook on the table. "The post-mortem confirms heart failure," he said. "Poison. No signs of violence." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So," she said softly, "we are expected to believe she simply died at the exact moment someone had just finished visiting her." The inspector frowned. No sign of a visitor, a pause. No forced entry, no disturbance. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the fireplace. "That depends," she said quietly, "on what one chooses to define as disturbance." The inspector followed her gaze. The ash had been collected and placed in a small container on the mantel. He opened it carefully. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Miss Marple leaned forward. "The paper," she said softly. "Yes," Mercer replied. "We've sent it for analysis." Miss Marple nodded. "But we already know what it was," she said. The inspector looked up. "You do?" She smiled faintly. "People who live alone," she said gently, "rarely burn things unless those things have meaning." A pause. "And meaning is usually written." That afternoon, the analysis report arrived. The ash contained traces of ink and fragments of parchment paper. Old, high quality, not modern correspondence. Inspector Mercer read the report twice, then a third time. "Interesting. Very interesting." "It was letters," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." Pause followed. "Old ones." The inspector looked at her. "You think she was hiding correspondence?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "I think," she said softly, "she was hiding a memory that someone did not want revisited." That evening, a new development emerged. The local vicar, Reverend Thomas Lacey, arrived at the cottage with visible discomfort. He had known Mrs. Hartwell in passing for many years. He described her as a woman who preferred silence over conversation. When asked about her visitors, he hesitated. "There were none," he said. Inspector Mercer frowned. "None at all?" The vicar shifted uncomfortably. "Not officially. Interesting. Very interesting." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Unofficially?" Reverend Lacey sighed. "There were rumours." A pause. "People claimed she received visits late in the evenings. Always discreet, always brief." The inspector leaned forward. "From whom?" Vicar hesitated again, then answered carefully. "A man from outside the village." Silence followed. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Did anyone know his name?" The vicar shook his head. "No, but he was seen near the cottage gate more than once." Inspector Mercer exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. The gate. Always the gate. That evening, they searched the perimeter of Greywood Cottage more carefully. Near the back path, partially hidden beneath overgrown ivy, Miss Marple noticed something unusual. A loose stone near the foundation wall. She crouched slowly. Inspector Mercer watched. "What is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She gently moved the stone aside. Inside was a small cavity, and within it, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a bundle of papers. The room became completely still. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer carefully retrieved it. The bundle was tied with faded ribbon. Old, deliberate, as though hidden long ago with intention rather than haste. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all handwritten, all dated more than 30 years earlier. Miss Marple examined the topmost letter. Her eyes softened slightly. "Wartime correspondence," she murmured. The inspector looked up sharply. "From whom?" She turned the page carefully. "Two people," she said softly. Pause. "Evelyn Hartwell, and someone named Arthur Delaney." Silence followed. The name carried weight. Not immediately recognizable to the inspector. But Miss Marple's expression had already changed. "Interesting, very interesting. These were not casual letters," she said quietly. The inspector frowned. "Then what were they?" Miss Marple looked at the bundle thoughtfully. "Promises," she replied. A pause. "And perhaps," she added gently, "the beginning of something someone else later decided did not have the right to exist." Outside, the wind moved through the hedges surrounding Greywood Cottage. But inside, everything had shifted. Because now it was no longer a question of natural death. It was a question of what these letters contained, and who had finally returned to take back after all these years. Part 3. The Man in the Wartime Letters. The discovery of the hidden bundle changed everything about Greywood Cottage. What had first appeared to be a quiet, solitary death was now unfolding into something far older and far more deliberate. Inspector Mercer sat at the table, with the letters carefully spread before him. Miss Marple, as always, observed rather than rushed, her attention resting on details. Others passed over too quickly. The paper was thin but well preserved. Wartime rationing paper, yet carefully kept. The ink had faded slightly, but not enough to hide the emotion behind the words. "Interesting, very interesting." Inspector Mercer broke the silence first. "These are love letters," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause followed, not the kind written casually. The inspector glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I mean," she said gently, "that these were written by people who believed they had no certainty of a future." Silence settled again. The letters were addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell, but not written under that name in the earlier ones. The first letters bore a different signature. Arthur Delaney. Inspector Mercer frowned. "That name came up in your earlier reading." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and now we begin to understand why." Paused. The inspector turned a page carefully. One letter stood out immediately. The handwriting was more urgent than the others, the ink slightly darker, though written under pressure. He read it aloud. "If anything happens to me, remember what we agreed about Greywood." The room became still. "Interesting. Very interesting." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "That sentence," she said quietly, "is the most important one we have seen so far." The inspector looked up. "Why?" she replied softly. "Because it suggests that Greywood Cottage was never simply a home, a pause, part of an arrangement." Silence followed. That evening, Inspector Mercer began checking wartime records at the county office. Miss Marple accompanied him, though she did not interfere. She simply observed the way documents were handled, the way certain names were recorded, more importantly, the gaps between those records. By late evening, Mercer returned with another discovery. Arthur Delaney had been a soldier stationed locally during the final months of the war. But his record contained something unusual. Interesting, very interesting. "He was declared missing," Mercer said. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And never officially confirmed dead? No, he replied. No body recovered, no formal closure. A pause. But there's more. He placed another file on the table. Arthur Delaney had been attached to a logistical unit responsible for transport of sensitive materials between military offices and civilian authorities. Miss Marple studied the document carefully, then spoke softly. That is not a combat role. No, Mercer agreed, but it gives him access. Silence followed. Access, a simple word. But in matters like these it was everything. That night, Miss Marple remained at the cottage longer than usual. She stood by the window, looking out at the darkened hedgerows. Inspector Mercer sat nearby, reviewing the letters again. You think he died during the war? He asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said quietly, I think that is what someone wanted everyone to believe. A pause. But I also think, she added gently, that belief is often more useful than truth. The inspector looked up. Useful to whom? Miss Marple turned slightly. To those who remain behind, she said softly. Silence followed. The next morning brought another development. A local resident, Mrs. Clara Wren, came forward after hearing about the discovery of wartime letters. She was elderly but clear-minded. She insisted she had something important to say. I remember him, she said immediately. Inspector Mercer frowned. Arthur Delaney? She nodded. He used to visit Greywood Cottage during the war. The room became very still. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Frequently? Not frequently, the woman replied carefully. But enough to be noticed. A pause. People spoke about it. Inspector Mercer leaned forward. Kind of man was he? Mrs. Wren hesitated, then answered quietly. Quiet. But he didn't belong here. Silence followed. Miss Marple asked softly. What do you mean? The woman looked down. He asked questions about land records once. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Land records, Greywood Cottage. Wartime correspondence. The pattern was becoming clearer, but not yet complete. After Mrs. Wren left, Inspector Mercer spoke quietly. Delaney was investigating something even during the war. Then this wasn't just a romance. Miss Marple nodded. No. A pause. It was already entangled with something else. She turned back toward the letters. And whatever that was, she added softly, someone has spent decades making sure it stayed buried. Outside, Greywood Cottage stood unchanged in the morning light, still quiet. And now, no longer simply a place where someone had died, but a place where a long-buried truth had finally begun to breathe again. Part 4. The Name That Should Not Exist. Part 4 of the investigation began. Greywood Cottage no longer felt like a simple scene of death, felt like a doorway. Not into a room, but into a past that had been carefully locked away and quietly ignored for decades. Inspector Mercer stood by the table where the wartime letters were laid out in order. The early morning light slanted through the window, falling across ink that had survived war, time, and now, death. Miss Marple sat nearby, watching not the papers themselves, the reactions they provoked in those who read them. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer finally spoke. Arthur Delaney was involved in wartime logistics, he said. Then he may have had access to civil records. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes. Pause followed. And access, she added softly, is often more important than authority. The inspector frowned slightly. You believe he changed something? I believe, Miss Marple replied carefully, that someone connected to him changed something that could not be undone easily. Silence followed. That afternoon, another file arrived from the county archives. It concerned Greywood Cottage itself, its ownership history, its legal transfers, and its inheritance line. Inspector Mercer opened it slowly. At first, everything appeared normal. Property passed through a series of family names over the decades. Then he stopped. Interesting. Very, very interesting. One entry had been altered, not recently, but long ago, very carefully. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What is it?" the inspector pointed. "The ownership record for Greywood Cottage. It changes hands during the war." A pause. "But the transfer certificate is unusual." Miss Marple studied the document, then said softly, "It is incomplete." "Yes," Mercer agreed. "There is no proper witness verification." Silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is not an oversight," she said gently. The inspector looked up. "No?" She shook her head. "No. It is a replacement. Interesting. Very interesting. Because now a pattern was forming. Wartime letters, missing soldier, property transfer anomalies, and a cottage that seemed to sit at the centre of all of it. That evening, Inspector Mercer visited the local registry office in person. Miss Marple remained at Greywood Cottage, studying the letters more closely, and there she found something she had been quietly expecting, but had hoped not to see. A repeated phrase in several of the later letters. Arthur Delaney wrote it more than once. "If they succeed in changing the records, no one will ever know what Greywood truly is." Silence followed. Interesting. Very interesting. She read it again, then again, because that sentence changed the direction of everything. Greywood Cottage was not merely a residence. It was something whose identity had been documented, and then deliberately altered. That night, Inspector Mercer returned with a new discovery. His expression was heavier than before. "There was another person," he said quietly. Miss Marple looked up. "Go on." He placed a new document on the table, a wartime casualty report, and beside Arthur Delaney's name was another, Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell. Silence followed. Miss Marple did not react immediately. She simply looked at the paper for a long moment, then asked softly, "Officially?" "Yes," Mercer said. "Both listed in the same transport incident. Both declared missing shortly after." A pause, but only one name was ever corrected later. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "And the other?" Mercer hesitated. "Correction exists." Interesting. Very interesting. The implication settled slowly into the room. One identity preserved, one erased. Greywood Cottage tied directly to both. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Then Mrs. Hartwell did not simply inherit this cottage." A pause. "She survived something tied to it." The inspector nodded slowly. "Yes." That night Miss Marple stood outside Greywood Cottage once more. Wind had risen slightly, moving through the hedges like a quiet warning. She looked at the darkened windows, then at the door, finally at the land itself, and she said very softly, "This cottage did not hide a death." A pause. "It hid a substitution." Behind her, the village of Little Renford remained quiet. But silence, she knew, was never absence of truth, only delay. Part 5. Cottage that should not have existed. By the time Part 5 of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage no longer felt like a simple location on the edge of Little Renford. It felt like a contradiction that had survived too long, a place where records, memory, and truth were no longer in agreement. Inspector Mercer returned early that morning, carrying a new set of certified copies from the county registry office. His expression suggested that whatever he had found had not been easy to interpret. Miss Marple was already seated by the window, watching the thin morning mist settle across the garden path. "Interesting. Very interesting. You were right," Mercer said quietly as he entered. Miss Marple did not turn immediately. "I often am," she replied gently. A faint pause followed. Then she looked at him. "What have you discovered?" The inspector placed the documents on the table. "The ownership of Greywood Cottage," he said, "does not follow a normal line of inheritance." Silence followed. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "I suspected as much." Mercer frowned. "Was transferred twice during the war years," he continued. "Once officially and once informally." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "That is unusual." "Yes," Mercer said, "because the informal transfer has no legal witness, only a signature." A pause. "And that signature belongs to a man who was never recorded as having authority over property matters." "Interesting. Very interesting." Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "Arthur Delaney," she said. The inspector nodded, yes. Silence settled again. Outside, Bird called sharply from the hedgerow, breaking the tension for only a moment. Then the room grew still once more. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Then Greywood Cottage was never simply passed through families." A pause. "It was reassigned." Mercer looked at her sharply. "Reassigned?" "Yes," she said gently. "As though someone needed it to belong somewhere else, for a reason that was never written down." The inspector exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Hartwell?" Miss Marple turned toward the window again. "She is part of that reassignment." A pause. "Not as owner. A gentle correction. Consequence." Silence followed. That afternoon, Inspector Mercer visited the last surviving clerk, who had worked at the registry during the war. The man was elderly now, living in a small cottage outside the village. At first, he refused to speak. But when Greywood Cottage was mentioned, something in his expression changed. Recognition, then hesitation. Interesting, very interesting. "I remember the confusion," he admitted finally. Mercer leaned forward. "Confusion?" The old clerk nodded slowly. "There were two claims," he said, "both urgent, both unusual." A pause. "One came from military channels, and one came from within the village." Silence followed. Miss Marple, who had joined the interview quietly, softly, "And which was accepted?" The clerk looked down. "The one that arrived first." "Interesting. Very interesting." Mercer frowned. "Timing decided ownership." The clerk nodded faintly. "In those days, yes." A pause. "Especially during the war. Things were processed quickly, without verification." Silence followed. Miss Marple spoke gently. "And what did that result in?" The clerk hesitated, then answered quietly. "Greywood Cottage changed hands before anyone realized what it was tied to." The room became still. Very still, because now a deeper structure emerged. Greywood Cottage had not simply been inherited or transferred. It had been claimed in a moment of administrative chaos, and later, protected by silence. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the wartime letters again. She studied Arthur Delaney's handwriting carefully. Something in the tone of the later letters that now felt different. Less romantic. More urgent. More aware. Very interesting. One sentence stood out more than the rest. "If Greywood is reassigned, Evelyn will not be safe." Miss Marple read it twice, then once more, and finally she understood something crucial. Greywood Cottage was not merely a home tied to Evelyn Hartwell. It was a location tied to her identity, safety, possibly even her official existence. If ownership or records changed, so could she. That night, Inspector Mercer arrived with one final discovery from the wartime archives. He placed it on the table without speaking. A casualty correction form. Miss Marple read it slowly, then paused. The document stated that Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell had been officially recorded as deceased, then later marked as identity unverified due to administrative loss. Silence followed. "Interesting. Very interesting." Mercer spoke quietly. "So she may not have been meant to survive in records at all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes." A pause, "but she did." The inspector looked at her. "And Arthur Delaney?" Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "I suspect," she said gently, "he was trying to ensure she remained what she was meant to be." Silence followed. Outside, Greywood Cottage stood in darkness once more. But now it no longer felt like a place of solitude. It felt like a place where identity itself had been rewritten, and someone, somewhere, had spent decades ensuring that rewrite would never be questioned. Part 6. Woman Who Was Not Meant to Be Found. By the time Part 6 of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage had become something more than a mystery. It had become a distortion in the village's history. A place where official truth and lived memory no longer matched. Inspector Mercer arrived earlier than usual that morning, carrying a thin envelope marked Wartime Registry Correction. Restricted access. He placed it on the table without speaking. His expression alone suggested that what was inside had changed his understanding of everything. Miss Marple looked up from her seat by the window. "You have something important," she said gently. "Yes," Mercer replied, "and I am not sure it should exist at all." "Interesting. Very interesting." He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single page, corrected wartime identity record. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly as he read. "Subject: Evelyn Hartwell," Mercer said quietly. "Original classification: missing, presumed deceased." A pause. "Amended classification: identity reassigned under civilian protection order." Silence followed. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her attention sharpened. "A protection order," she repeated softly. "Yes," Mercer said. "Issued by military administration." A pause. "Signed by someone from intelligence liaison." The room became still. "Interesting. Very interesting." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So she was not merely recorded incorrectly," she said gently. "She was deliberately removed from one identity structure and placed into another." The inspector looked at her. "That is what it suggests." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple asked softly, "And Arthur Delaney?" Mercer hesitated. "He was listed as the requesting officer." Room became completely still. Interesting. Very interesting. That name now connected everything. The letters, the cottage, the identity shift, and the silence that followed both their wartime disappearance and Evelyn Hartwell's reappearance in village records. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Then Arthur Delaney was not merely a correspondent." A pause. "He was an administrator of identity." The inspector nodded slowly. "Yes." Long silence followed. Outside, Greywood Cottage stood in the pale morning light, unchanged. But inside, everything was shifting. That afternoon, Inspector Mercer received a second report, this time from military archives, cross-referenced with civil death records. What he read caused him to sit down without speaking for several seconds. Very interesting. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Arthur Delaney was never officially declared missing." Miss Marple looked up. "Explain." Mercer turned the page. "His record shows discharge after the war." A pause. "But no civilian trace exists after that point." Silence followed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So he did not disappear." A pause. "He was removed." The inspector looked at her sharply. "Removed?" "Yes," she said gently. "From documentation." Silence followed. Then Miss Marple added softly, "And from consequence." That evening, they revisited Greywood Cottage for the first time since the discovery of the hidden letters. The atmosphere felt heavier now, not because of fear, because understanding changes how a place feels. Inside, Miss Marple moved directly to the writing desk. She opened the lower drawer again. This time, she noticed something new. A faint impression on the wood lining. Something had been stored there for a long time. And removed recently. Inspector Mercer noticed her focus. "What is it?" Miss Marple replied quietly. "Something was taken from here." A pause. "After her death." The inspector frowned. "But the room was sealed." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause, "but not permanently." She turned slightly. "Someone had access." Silence followed. "Interesting. Very interesting." That night, a final piece of evidence arrived. A local nurse who had attended Mrs. Hartwell in her final weeks came forward voluntarily. She had been hesitant, but something about recent discoveries compelled her to speak. "I remember her last days," she said softly. Inspector Mercer listened carefully. She was not confused, the nurse continued. Not at all. A pause. She was waiting. Miss Marple's gaze lifted slightly. Waiting for what? The nurse hesitated, then answered quietly. For someone to come back. Silence followed. Interesting. Very interesting. The implications settled heavily in the room. Miss Marple spoke gently. Did anyone visit her before she died? The nurse hesitated, then nodded faintly. One man, she said. Inspector Mercer leaned forward immediately. Name? The nurse shook her head. No name given. A pause. She knew him. Silence followed. Miss Marple folded her hands slowly. Then Greywood Cottage was not isolated. A pause. It was being watched. Sorry. Outside, the wind moved through the hedgerows, and for the first time, Inspector Mercer understood what Miss Marple had already begun to see clearly. Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell had not simply lived in solitude. She had lived inside a carefully maintained arrangement of identity, memory, and protection. And now that arrangement had begun to collapse, because someone had returned, and whatever had been hidden inside Greywood Cottage all those years ago was no longer meant to stay buried. Part 7. The Visitor, Who Should Not Be Alive. By the time Part 7 of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage no longer felt like a place shaped by the past, felt like a place being actively re-entered by it. Someone, had begun circling back into the edges of the story that had remained buried for decades. Inspector Mercer arrived at the cottage with an urgency he no longer tried to hide. He placed a new report on the table without ceremony. Miss Marple looked at him quietly. You have found something, she said softly. Yes, he replied, and it complicates everything again. Interesting, very interesting. He opened the file. Inside was a newly recovered hospital intake record from the final weeks of the war. Miss Marple read it carefully. Then paused, very slightly, then again. Because the name on the document should not have been there, Inspector Mercer spoke. Arthur Delaney was admitted to a military field hospital near the end of the war, he said. Severe injuries, classified transport involvement. A pause. But he didn't die there. Silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. He survived? The inspector hesitated. That's the problem. A pause. There is no death record, no discharge follow-up, no civilian transition file. Interesting. Very interesting. Miss Marple folded her hands. So he disappears after recovery? Yes, Mercer said, as though he was removed from the system entirely. Silence followed. That detail mattered. Very much, because in official records, absence was rarely accidental. It was intentional. Miss Marple spoke softly. Then someone ensured he could not be traced. The inspector nodded slowly. That is what it looks like. A pause. But there is more. He placed another page on the table. A witness statement, recently declassified. It had been written by a hospital orderly decades earlier. Miss Marple read it carefully. Interesting. Very interesting, the statement read. The patient Arthur Delaney was visited once during recovery. A civilian woman. She stayed only briefly. The conversation was private. After that visit, records relating to the patient were sealed under military instruction. Silence followed. Miss Marple looked up. Mrs. Hartwell, she said softly. The inspector nodded. Yes, a pause. So she knew he was alive after the war. The inspector exhaled, slowly. And possibly helped initiate the protection order that removed him from official records. Silence followed. Interesting. Very interesting. That evening a new development arrived unexpectedly. A man had been seen near Greywood Cottage. Not a stranger, not a villager. But someone remembered from wartime descriptions. An elderly visitor matching Arthur Delaney's known physical appearance. Inspector Mercer received the report in silence, then immediately went to Miss Marple. This changes everything, he said. Miss Marple looked at him calmly. No, she replied softly. It completes a pattern. The inspector frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple stood slowly. If Arthur Delaney survived, she said gently. Then everything that followed becomes deliberate, not accidental. Pause. Mrs. Hartwell's isolation, the sealed records, the inheritance anomalies. The inspector's expression tightened. And her death? Miss Marple looked toward the window. That depends on what she was about to reveal. Silence followed that night. Inspector Mercer and Miss Marple returned to Greywood Cottage once more. The atmosphere inside felt different again. Not empty, not quiet, but expectant. As though something had been disturbed recently. Miss Marple moved directly to the writing desk. This time she noticed something new, faint scratch mark near the lock. Recent. The inspector saw it immediately. Someone forced it open, he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Pause. And took something. The room became still. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer looked around carefully. Could they still want? Miss Marple replied, softly. Confirmation, a pause. That Mrs. Hartwell still had proof. Silence followed. Then, from the mantelpiece, Mercer noticed something missing. A small brass box that had been there previously, empty now. Removed. The inspector's voice lowered. So the letters are gone. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. A pause. And whoever took them knew exactly what they were looking for. Outside, the wind moved through Greywood Cottage's hedgerows more sharply now, less like nature. More like disturbance. Miss Marple stood by the window for a long moment, then spoke softly. Arthur Delaney is not simply part of the past. A pause. He is part of what is returning to correct it. Silence followed, and for the first time, Inspector Mercer felt it clearly. Greywood Cottage was no longer a closed case. It was an opening. Something that had been sealed for decades was now beginning to move again. Quietly, deliberately, and with intent. Part 8. The letter that was never meant to be read. By the time Part 8 of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage no longer felt like a place where things were simply sinning. It felt like a place where things were being actively erased. Inspector Mercer stood in the middle of the sitting room, staring at the empty mantel where the brass box had once been. His expression was tight now, controlled, but no longer calm. They knew we would come back, he said quietly. Miss Marple, standing near the window, did not respond immediately. She was looking at something else. Not the room, not the absence, but the pattern of absence. Interesting. Yes, she said at last. And more importantly, they returned before us. A pause followed. That detail mattered, very much, because timing in matters like these was never accidental. Inspector Mercer turned toward her. If the letters have been taken, he said, then our only direct link to what Mrs. Hartwell knew is gone. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, a pause, but not entirely, the inspector frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple stepped slowly toward the writing desk. She opened the lower drawer again. Empty, but she did not seem surprised. Instead, she looked at the lining of the drawer carefully. Then she tapped it lightly. There is a difference, she said softly, between something being removed and something being understood too late. The inspector watched her. You think she left something behind? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she pressed gently along the inner edge of the drawer. A faint click followed. The inspector stiffened. What was that? Miss Marple carefully pulled out a thin, concealed panel. Inside was a single folded page, carefully hidden, very deliberately placed. Silence filled the room. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer reached for it immediately, but Miss Marple stopped him gently. Let us not rush, she said softly. He paused, then nodded. She unfolded the paper. It was not a letter. Not exactly. It was a note. Short, precise. Written in a hand that trembled slightly but remained controlled. Miss Marple read it quietly, then stopped. Her expression changed just slightly. Not shock, not surprise. Recognition. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer leaned forward. "What does it say?" Miss Marple handed it to him. He read it, slowly. Then again. The note read, "If anything happens to me, it is not illness. The man from the war has returned. He knows I kept the originals. Greywood must not be allowed to speak again." Silence followed. The room felt colder. Inspector Mercer looked up sharply. "The man from the war," he repeated. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," a pause. "Arthur Delaney." The inspector exhaled slowly. "But this changes everything." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No," she said softly. "It confirms what we already suspected." A pause. She was not dying naturally. Silence followed. That afternoon, Inspector Mercer issued an immediate request to check all recent visitor records in the surrounding parish area. Response came back quickly. No official visitors, no registered inquiries. But one detail stood out. A local shopkeeper reported seeing an elderly man near Greywood Cottage 2 nights before Mrs. Hartwell's death. He had asked a single question. Interesting, very interesting. "Is she still protecting what was taken from the cottage?" Inspector Mercer read the statement twice, then looked up. He knew she was guarding something, he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause, and he returned to retrieve it. Silence followed. That evening, the inspector and Miss Marple visited the village archive office together. The clerk there was nervous now. The case had grown too strange for comfort. Too connected, too unresolved. After some searching, he produced a single overlooked document, wartime administrative memo, stamped, official, and deeply unsettling. Inspector Mercer read it aloud slowly. "All correspondence and records relating to Greywood Cottage identity transfer to be sealed indefinitely due to security sensitivity. No civilian access permitted without direct authorization." Silence followed. "Interesting. Very interesting," Miss Marple spoke softly. The secrecy was not local, a pause. It was sanctioned. The inspector frowned. "But why would Greywood Cottage require such protection?" Miss Marple looked down at the paper thoughtfully. "Because," she said gently, "it was not just a property." A pause, part of a protected identity arrangement. Silence followed. The inspector's voice lowered. "Mrs. Hartwell was part of that arrangement." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause. "And Arthur Delaney likely created it." The room became still. That night, Miss Marple stood once again outside Greywood Cottage. The wind moved through the hedgerows more sharply now. Not gentle, not quiet, restless. She looked at the dark windows. Then at the door, then spoke softly to herself. The truth was never lost here. A pause. It was guarded. Behind her. The village of Little Renford remained unaware that something long buried was no longer content to stay hidden, and somewhere in the distance, something that had waited for decades was now fully awake again. Part 9. The Man Who Came Back for the Truth. By the time Part 9 of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage was no longer a closed mystery. It had become a living tension. Something unfinished. Something that refused to stay in the past. Inspector Mercer stood by the window, rereading Mrs. Hartwell's hidden note, again and again, as though repetition might reveal a different meaning. It did not. The meaning remained the same. Unsettling. Clear. Final. Interesting. Very interesting. Miss Marple sat quietly nearby, watching him more than the paper now, because she understood something important. People rarely reacted to what they read. They reacted to what they confirmed. At last Mercer spoke. "Arthur Delaney has returned," he said slowly. "Then he is not simply a memory from wartime records." A pause. "He is real." Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, a silence followed. That simple word changed the atmosphere entirely. Real, not theoretical, not archival. Real, that afternoon. A breakthrough arrived from the railway station records. An elderly man, matching Arthur Delaney's wartime description, had been seen arriving in the region 3 days before Mrs. Hartwell's death. he had purchased no ticket return. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer read the report twice. He stayed, he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, a pause. And that timing matters. The inspector frowned. You think he came back for her? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said softly, I think he came back for what she was keeping. Silence followed. That evening, they revisited the cottage again. This time the air felt different. Not still, not quiet, but expectant, as though something inside had already been disturbed and was waiting to be fully uncovered. Inspector Mercer immediately noticed it. Front door latch had been forced again, but more carefully this time. Controlled, deliberate, very interesting. Inside, the sitting room had been searched. Drawers opened, books disturbed, the mantelpiece cleared completely. The brass box was gone. Miss Marple surveyed the room calmly. He was here again, she said softly. The inspector nodded. Yes. A pause. This time he found what he wanted.
Silence followed.
But Miss Marple stepped toward the writing desk. She studied the surface carefully, paused. Her gaze sharpened slightly. There is something missing, she said quietly. Inspector Mercer frowned. Everything is missing. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, a pause. Something specific. She pointed to the ink stains on the desk. They were writing here recently. The inspector looked closer. You think she wrote something else before she died? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Pause. And it is no longer here. Silence followed. That realization was heavier than the theft itself, because it suggested intention, not accident, not coincidence, but removal of final testimony. That night, Inspector Mercer visited the village postmaster again. This time, under urgency. He showed him the known photograph of Arthur Delaney. The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, he said. I saw him. Interesting. Very interesting. When? Mercer asked. 2 days before the death, the postmaster replied. A pause. He asked if anyone still visited Greywood Cottage regularly. Silence followed. Miss Marple, standing beside Mercer, asked softly, What did you tell him? The postmaster hesitated. Nothing. A pause. He already knew. Silence followed. That detail mattered, very much, because it suggested knowledge, not inquiry. Familiarity, not discovery. That evening, Miss Marple stood alone outside Greywood Cottage once more. The wind had changed. Stronger now, more unsettled. She looked at the house carefully, then spoke softly. Mrs. Hartwell was not simply protecting letters. She was protecting a truth that someone else had spent a lifetime trying to retrieve. Post. Behind her, the village lights flickered faintly in the distance, and for the first time, Miss Marple understood the full weight of what was unfolding. Arthur Delaney had not returned to question the past. He had returned to reclaim it, and Greywood Cottage was where the past had been kept alive long enough to become dangerous again. Part 10. Truth in the final letter. By the time Part 10 of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage no longer felt like a place that held secrets. It felt like a place that had already given them up, piece by piece. Under pressure, it could no longer resist. Inspector Mercer stood in the middle of the sitting room, now almost stripped bare by repeated searches. Even the silence felt different, not empty, but exhausted. Miss Marple, however, remained focused. Because exhaustion in a mystery never meant completion. It only meant the final layer was close. Interesting. The breakthrough came that afternoon. Not from Greywood Cottage, from a retired wartime records officer, brought in from the county archives. He arrived with a single sealed envelope, his hands slightly trembling as he placed it on the table. This should not exist in civilian hands, he said quietly. Inspector Mercer frowned. Then why is it here? The man hesitated. Because it was never officially closed. Silence followed. Miss Marple looked at the envelope, not at its condition, but at its weight. Something about it felt final. She spoke softly. "Open it." The inspector did. Inside was a single document, stamped wartime classification. And at the top, a heading that made the room feel suddenly colder. Greywood Cottage, identity control file interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer read aloud slowly. Subject, Evelyn Hartwell. Status, protected civil identity asset. A pause, he continued. Assigned guardian, Arthur Delaney. Silence followed. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Yes, she said softly. A pause. That explains everything. The inspector looked at her sharply. No, he said. It explains too much. Miss Marple nodded gently. Precisely, because now the structure was visible. Not romance, not coincidence, but administration. Identity management, controlled protection, and something darker underneath it all. Mercer continued reading. All external claims to Greywood Cottage must be redirected. Subject Evelyn Hartwell must not appear in any conflicting legal or inheritance documentation. The room became very still. Interesting, very interesting. The inspector lowered the paper slowly. So she was not just hidden, he said quietly. She was preserved, Miss Marple replied. A pause, and Greywood Cottage was part of that preservation. Silence followed. That afternoon, another discovery arrived, this time from local police interviews. A shopkeeper had recalled something he had not mentioned earlier, an argument, outside Greywood Cottage. 2 days before Mrs. Hartwell's death. Interesting, very interesting. Inspector Mercer read the statement aloud. An elderly man was speaking to her at the gate. He was insistent. She refused to open the door. He said something about restoring what was taken. Silence followed. Miss Marple spoke softly. Arthur Delaney. The inspector nodded. Yes. Pause. So he did not come peacefully. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, a pause. He came for correction. Silence followed. That evening they returned once more to Greywood Cottage. But this time, something had changed. The front door was no longer just forced. It had been properly opened, and left slightly ajar. Inspector Mercer stepped inside carefully. The letters are gone, he said immediately. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. A pause. But not everything. She moved toward the writing desk. This time she noticed something new. Faint impression in the wood grain. Pressure marks, recent writing, then removal. She touched the surface lightly. Something was written here after the first search, she said softly. The inspector frowned. But we checked the room yesterday. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. A pause, which means someone returned after we left. Silence followed. Very slowly, Inspector Mercer understood. This wasn't just retrieval, he said quietly. This was reconstruction. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, a pause. Someone is rewriting the final version of events. That night, Miss Marple stood once again outside Greywood Cottage. But now she was no longer looking at it as a place. She was looking at it as a record that multiple hands had tried to control. Preserve, protect, and now, correct. Behind her, the village remained still. But in the distance, she could sense it clearly. The final piece had already begun to move, and whatever truth Greywood Cottage had hidden for decades was no longer waiting to be found. It was waiting to be concluded. Part 11. The Secret of Greywood Cottage. By the time the final part of the investigation began, Greywood Cottage no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a truth waiting to be accepted. Inspector Mercer stood in silence by the empty writing desk. The room, once filled with fragments of hidden history, now stripped of almost everything that had once given it meaning. Even the air felt lighter, though the house itself had finally exhaled after decades of holding its breath. Miss Marple stood near the window. She was not looking at the cottage anymore. She was looking beyond it. Interesting, very interesting. Inspector Mercer finally spoke. It's over, he said quietly. Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because she knew better than anyone that over was a dangerous word in matters like these. At last she said softly, "No, my dear, it is understood." A pause followed. That distinction mattered very much. That morning, the final report from the wartime archive arrived. It contained everything. Arthur Delaney's role was now fully confirmed. Not a soldier lost to history, not a missing lover, but a wartime intelligence liaison assigned to protect a civilian identity asset. Evelyn Hartwell. Greywood Cottage was not simply a home. It was a protected identity location, used to preserve a woman whose existence had become entangled in wartime, operations and inheritance, disputes that extended beyond the village itself. But the report contained one final line that changed the tone of everything that had come before. All protection protocols were compromised. When Arthur Delaney returned independently in later years, seeking restoration of original identity records, silence followed. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer looked up slowly. "So he came back," he said quietly. "Not to destroy," but Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause. "And restoration," she added gently, "is often more dangerous than concealment." The inspector frowned. "But then, why did Mrs. Hartwell die?" Miss Marple turned slightly toward him. "Because," she said softly, "she no longer wished the past to be restored." Silence followed. And now, finally, truth settled into its final shape. Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell had not been a passive victim of history. She had been its keeper. She had lived alone, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. She had protected the sealed identity arrangement for decades after the war ended, and when Arthur Delaney returned, he did not find agreement. He found resistance. Inspector Mercer exhaled slowly. "So it was not murder for gain," he said quietly. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No," a pause. "It was conflict over truth itself." Silence followed. That afternoon, final witness statement arrived from a distant railway clerk. It confirmed the last movement of Arthur Delaney. He had been seen leaving the station near Little Renford the night before Mrs. Hartwell's death. But not alone. Interesting. Very interesting. Inspector Mercer read the statement slowly. "There was another person," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A pause. "That is the part everyone missed." The inspector looked at her sharply. "Who?" Miss Marple turned toward the window again. "Someone who understood both versions of the truth," she said softly. A pause. "And chose which one would survive." Silence followed. That evening, Inspector Mercer closed the case file, but Miss Marple remained by the window a little longer. Greywood Cottage stood unchanged outside, still, quiet, no longer hiding anything, and yet somehow still keeping its dignity. Finally, she spoke softly. "The secret was never just about identity." A pause. "It was about who has the right to decide what identity becomes." She turned away gently. Behind her, Inspector Mercer said nothing, because now he understood. Greywood Cottage had not concealed a simple crime. It had sheltered a controlled truth, one shaped by war, loyalty, love, fear. And when that truth could no longer remain unchanged, someone had chosen silence over exposure. And now, at last, was nothing left to hide. Only the understanding that some secrets do not end when they are revealed. They end when they are finally allowed to be understood.